Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Lobbedez. I'm a PhD candidate at EMLYON Business Schools and at the University Paris-Dauphine. And I'm very thankful to the CMS division and the journal organization for awarding me this year the prize of the best doctoral student paper. Above all, I'm very honored to be given the opportunity to share a little bit of my research on the Elvis protest through this short video. The research that I'm going to present was initially motivated by repeated observations during my dissertation fieldwork of escalations between activists and the police and violent outbursts in protest. By violence, I mean here the potential or actual physical harm. Over the course of my 15-month ethnography, I was able to observe various expressions of police violence in the sense of the justified and unjustified use of physical force against citizens, but I was also able to observe the use of violent protest tactics from activists. These usually involved at least two people and inflicting physical damage on objects and/or people, for instance, through arson, property damage, or physical assaults. As a consequence, the question of violence quickly became omnipresent in my field. And in fact, various researchers before me emphasized that the Elvis protests were one of the most violent social conflicts in France since May 1968. They have also argued that it crystallized a general shift in French policing style to stricter and militarized tactics. They described the combination between violent and nonviolent actions as unique to the movement compared to other occupation movements. And they highlighted that violence was used intensively in the media and in public discourses as a lens to discuss the mobilization. Building on my field experience and on these first analysis, my paper is in that sense anchored in the idea that violent protests often constitute pivotal episodes for resistance movement, and that they are highly dynamic and interactional spaces where people negotiate and contest power relations, specifically with the police. So basically, actors adapt to one another, and there's often patterns of diffusion in tactics. Violence can be used by protesters as a symbolic resource to reach people's opinion or disrupt public order, and in that sense, to set their agenda. But it can also have the reverse effect and impact the movement image. To get a sense of what I'm talking about, and before actually getting into the core of my argument, I propose that we quickly immerse ourselves in the context of one of these protests. In this audio, you could hear the explosion of police grenades, as well as the breaking of a shop window. And I hope this excerpt gave you a sense of the type of confrontational atmosphere I discovered during my fieldwork. With this in mind, I aimed more specifically at explaining how protest movement could effectively challenge police violence meant to contain or repress their dissent. And this both pragmatically, but also in the eyes of the public, while at the same time sustaining this violence as a tactic. And to do so, I look at how actors organize on the ground. Interestingly, there is a growing body of work looking at the intersection of organizations and violence. Various studies have in particular unpacked how violence could be used as a strategic resource to maintain social order or achieve compliance. And in these cases, violence is often a repressive, oppressive, or exploitative instrument for actors withholding power. On the other hand, our discipline has for long left little room for resistance agency. Many researchers argued that effective resistance could hardly happen, especially in the face of violence, and that most resistance would remaining inconsequential. More recent analysis moved away from this prevailing understanding and highlighted that the effect and impact of resistance should be evaluated based on the context and conditions of this very resistance. They showed that violence shaped resisting option and described various ways through which people cope and work around it. But it's largely mechanisms through which actors try to avoid or limit physical harm, or potentially create waves of relations, but rarely mechanisms through which they act on violence and seize it as an object of resistance. This is precisely what I wish to address in my findings. I propose to look at the activity created and developed by resistors to publicize their dissents and to produce objects to temporarily set their agenda. Or in other words, I look at the resisting work performed by resistors to specifically absorb violent protest. I mean absorbing in the sense that this work helps them bear violence, but also using it as their own and making it something which can serve their cause. To that end, I unpacked 3 specific organized responses: physical care, which helped ensuring prevention and healing people; paralegal assistance, which supported people to navigate the legal system, especially when they were arrested or injured; and violence publicization, which constituted in the dissemination of images and storytelling on violent protests. Each this response relied on various internal organizing practices, online as well as offline, from the Yellow Vests themselves, but also on network building with street medics, lawyers, or independent journalists and filmmakers. This work enabled to mobilize and produce various types of resources, either physical and financial, human, symbolic, and discourses resources. For instance, in the case of physical care, protesters could access health supplies such as saline solutions or be trained for first-hand care. A money pot was organized to pay the legal fee for people by being arrested, and people received precise legal advice through paralegal assistance. Violent publicization also helps circulating counter narratives and arguments on violent protest and create and build on collective imaginaries. Physical care, paralegal assistance, and violent publicization fed one another. For instance, the medical advice provided in the case of an injury could later be used to prepare potential evidence for a trial against the police. Similarly, the production and dissemination of images of violent protest could be used to pressure justice institutions and mobilize influential international bodies. Ultimately, this resistance work helped absorbing violent protests in various ways. First, on the short term, they enabled protesters to forestall police violence and to collect evidence to resist police violence. At the same time, they also supported the deployment of violent protest tactics by providing activists with concrete financial supports in the case of arrests, producing arguments and image to work at legitimizing their actions, and by training people to stick together in protest and avoiding people to be isolated and more easily arrested in these events. On the long run, my findings also suggest that the resisting work participated in making police violence visible, questioning the legitimacy of the use of force against citizens by the police in the eyes of the public. The symbolic and discursive resources also invited to reframe violent protest and interrogate police accountability as well as protesters' motive. My core contribution is hence to the literature on resistance to organized violence. I provide an alternative narrative on how resistors can respond to violence. Research often describes them as either engaging in hidden, subtle, or non-impositional forms of resistance in the face of violence, or trying to limit and restrict violence. I, on the contrary, look at how they can use it as a strategic resource to set their agenda and achieve some sort of recognition. In that sense, resistors are in my study more than mere recipients of violence, but they can also act on it and seize it for their struggle. I hence also move away from one of the prevailing views in social movements studies, which has historically portrayed violent protest as effect of irrational, spontaneous, or deviant crowd, or simply short-term byproducts of a mobilization. And I avoid this way taking the lens of nonviolence, which remains predominant in most analysis of contemporary movements. More generally, I also believe that we should analyze the construct of violence and nonviolence as a continuum rather than opposing them. Because opposing them tends to skew our understanding of resistance movement and focus essentially on dynamics of competitions between activists over collaborations. In terms of future research, it'd be really valuable to observe the variation in these mechanisms I present today and their impact in other mobilizations and protests. For instance, to what extent race, gender, or class may alter the effect of this resisting work. Besides, the three organized responses I unfold in this paper are far from exhaustive. Depending on the context, there may be other types of absorbing resisting work, which could be further explored. I hope this video will have triggered your interest in the organizing of resistance movement and provided you with a glimpse of my research and research I propose to address. If you want to further discuss and engage in the conversation, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to discuss this with you. And thank you again for watching and engaging with my research.